In 2026, something subtle but dangerous begins to happen in India. The walls separating foreign policy, domestic politics, and the economy start to dissolve. For years, New Delhi could absorb shocks abroad and compensate at home. A tense border here, a diplomatic setback there, and yet strong growth numbers, electoral wins, and reform headlines kept the story intact. But this time is different. The impact of U.S. tariffs is no longer theoretical. It is no longer future risk. It is pressure slow, compounding, and increasingly visible. What looked like a foreign policy problem is becoming an economic one. What felt like an economic challenge is inching into politics. And what once could be managed separately is now converging into a single test of governance. If you want to understand India's next phase, not just where it stands, but where it may stumble, stay with me. Because to see what's coming, we first need to understand how all of this became entangled. To grasp why 2026 matters, we need to be clear about the problem India is facing. This is not simply a bad year in diplomacy, nor is it just an economic slowdown triggered by external pressure. It is the loss of insulation. In the past, India's foreign policy setbacks could be quarantined. A tense relationship with Washington did not immediately threaten growth. Regional instability did not directly endanger domestic political momentum. That buffer is now thinning. U.S. tariffs tied to Russia are no longer abstract signals. They are structural constraints that affect trade, investment, and confidence. At the same time, India's claim to strategic autonomy is being tested not in theory, but in practice through exclusions, silences, and shifting alliances. The result is a convergence. Foreign policy choices are shaping economic outcomes. Economic stress is feeding political risk, just as key state elections approach. This is the moment where systems intersect. And to understand how India arrived here, we must step back and look at the path that led to this convergence. To see how this convergence took shape, we need to rewind. India's foreign policy over the past decade was built on a careful bet: engage everyone, depend on no one, trade with the West, buy energy from Russia, speak for the global South, and avoid being pulled into rigid blocks. For a long time, this worked. Globalization rewarded scale. India's vast domestic market softened external shocks. Strategic autonomy gave New Delhi flexibility room to maneuver when others were forced to choose sides. But the global environment has changed. Great power competition has hardened. Trade is no longer just economic. It is political. Technology is no longer neutral. It is strategic. As the United States pushed tariffs and sanctions, and as supply chains became tools of statecraft, flexibility began to look like ambiguity. Autonomy began to look like unreliability. At the same time, instability in India's neighborhood and strained ties with Washington exposed how much the old buffer depended on a permissive global order, one that is now fading. This history matters, because once the system changes, strategies that once protected you can start to work against you. And in 2025, that shift became impossible to ignore. Then came the shock that made the shift visible. In May 2025, a 4-day conflict with Pakistan erupted, brief, contained, but telling. It was followed almost immediately by something more damaging: a downturn in India-Lash relations. Washington imposed 50% tariffs on India, not quietly, not symbolically, but explicitly tied to India's purchase of Russian crude and the failure to secure a trade deal. And then came the signal that stung the most. The United States deepened its outreach to Islamabad. For New Delhi, this was not just a diplomatic setback, it was a warning, because tariffs do not stay at the border. They seep into supply chains, investor sentiment, and long-term growth. And for the first time, India could not easily offset the foreign policy loss with a domestic victory not yet. If you're finding this familiar, it's because moments like this rarely announce themselves as crises. They arrive quietly, then compound. And beneath the headlines, something more structural was already taking shape, a mechanism that explains why these pressures are so hard to contain. What's happening beneath the surface is not a single policy failure. It is a system revealing its limits. India's strategy rests on remaining economically open while politically non-aligned. But the global economy no longer separates the two. Tariffs, sanctions, and technology controls now function as tools of alignment. They reward predictability. They punish ambiguity. As Washington considers additional sanctions on countries doing business with Russia, India's room to maneuver narrows. Trade diversion can soften the blow, but it cannot erase it, especially when growth data was recorded before the full force of tariffs took hold. At the same time, India's ambition to become a manufacturing hub runs into hard constraints. In semiconductors, India excels in design, but production remains focused on trailing-edge chips. Manufacturing demands water and electricity precisely where shortages persist. This is the hidden mechanism. A world that once tolerated strategic autonomy now demands strategic clarity. And when clarity is absent, exclusion follows not loudly, but decisively. Which brings us to the second moment of rupture, one that didn't involve conflict or tariffs, but something far more symbolic. The rupture came without confrontation. In December, India was excluded from the inaugural summit of the Trump administration's Pax Silica initiative. No sanctions, no public rebuke, just absence. And in diplomacy, absence speaks. Pax Silica was about critical and emerging technologies, the very domain where India hopes to anchor its future growth. For years, India was described as a natural beneficiary of supply chain diversification away from China. But exclusion from this initiative signaled something unsettling. India was no longer central. It was peripheral. Yes, U.S. tech giants continue to invest Google, Amazon, Microsoft, but much of that investment is in data centers, not advanced manufacturing. Presence without primacy. This moment crystallized a deeper reality. Strategic autonomy, once an asset, is now under scrutiny. Not because India chose poorly, but because the system no longer rewards hedging. And when you are quietly sidelined in technology, the consequences ripple outward into jobs, into growth, into politics, which is where this story turns personal. Because these pressures do not stay in conference rooms or summit halls. They reach you. When foreign policy and economics converge, the impact eventually lands on the same place, your daily life. If growth slows, it is not an abstract statistic. It shapes job creation, wage growth, public spending. You may not follow tariff schedules or trade negotiations, but you feel their consequences. A factory expansion delayed, an investment quietly redirected, a promise of opportunity that arrives later or not at all. In 2026, this matters politically. India heads into elections in 4 states and 1 union territory. Economic confidence has long been the government's strongest shield. But if that confidence weakens, even slightly, foreign policy choices begin to carry domestic costs. This is where the insulation finally breaks. And for the first time in years, voters are asked indirectly to absorb the price of strategic ambiguity. If this analysis helps you see the connections others ignore, take a moment to reflect on it. Understanding systems is the first step to navigating them. Because what happens next will not stay within India's borders. What unfolds inside India does not stay inside India. When a country of this scale adjusts or falters, the effects travel outward, through markets, through diplomacy, through geopolitics. India's muted responses to global flashpoints reveal this tension. In Venezuela, New Delhi issued a brief statement of deep concern, focusing primarily on safeguarding its nationals. In Gaza, restraint preserved ties with Israel. In Ukraine, silence maintained space with Russia. Each decision made sense in isolation. Together, they created an image of distance. India speaks of a rules-based international order, of sovereignty, territorial integrity, and equality of states. Yet when those principles are tested, its voice is often restrained. This ambiguity shapes perception. Among Western partners, it raises questions of reliability. Among the global South, it complicates India's claim to leadership. In 2026, as India chairs BRICS and hosts major summits, this balancing act will be on display. The world will be watching not for what India says, but for where it stands. And the next chapter depends on whether balance remains possible at all. Looking ahead, India's trajectory in 2026 can be understood through 3 possible paths. The first is managed adaptation. Trade diversion works. A deal with the European Union is concluded. Summit diplomacy restores confidence, and the economic drag from tariffs is contained. Strategic autonomy survives narrower, but intact. The second is strategic drift. Tariffs persist. EU negotiations drag on, as they have since 2007. India hosts summits, welcomes leaders, but influence does not translate into leverage. Growth slows gradually. Politics becomes more cautious, more defensive. The third is systemic strain. Additional sanctions materialize. Economic pressure deepens as elections approach. A security crisis, perhaps triggered by non-state actors, forces escalation. In this scenario, ambiguity collapses under stress. None of these futures is predetermined. They are shaped by choices, timing, and the global system's tolerance for hedging. This is the paradox India now faces. Strategic autonomy was designed to maximize options, but in a world demanding alignment, it may instead compress them. And that brings us to the final question, what this moment truly reveals. This moment is not a verdict on India's rise. It is a test of how that rise is managed. For years, India thrived in a world that rewarded balance. Flexibility was strength. Ambiguity was leverage. Growth smoothed over contradictions. But 2026 exposes a harder truth. In a fragmented global order, economics punishes hesitation. Technology rewards trust. And foreign policy choices now echo directly into domestic life. India will still host summits, still welcome presidents and prime ministers, still speak in the language of autonomy and leadership. The question is whether those symbols can substitute for influence, or whether influence now requires clearer choices. If you take one insight from this analysis, let it be this: systems change faster than narratives, and when they do, past success is no guarantee of future protection. If you want to keep understanding how power, economics, and politics collide, not just in India, but globally, stay with this conversation. The next chapter is already forming.